So in this video, I'm going to be running through pretty much how to train into a meet. If you don't know what training into a meet is, it's essentially a peaking strategy used to take advantage of the predictability that one establishes within training or within a specific training session or training week, um, whatever it may be. We're really essentially just doing the opposite of the standard larger scale taper approach that a lot of people will take, where they will tack an additional taper week to the tail end of a meet prep, and use that to their advantage to inflate recovery and just get the athlete feeling as fresh as possible on the day. Training into the meet, in a sense, is really just take not having that additional taper week for the purpose of inflating recovery going into meet day, and instead lining up meet day with a certain predictable session from training. So there's not much of an intro to give. I think if I just get right into it, it'll make a bit more sense in terms of how I approach things. But the TLDR is I personally am a big fan of when the opportunity arises itself to train into a meet. There are plenty of athletes that I coach that I tack that additional taper week onto their prep, and it works great, and they show up very strong on meet day. Those are typically the lifters that need to be more recovered and don't really have as much predictability established in their training, versus the other lifters where I think there's a lot of times you can actually orient training around heightening predictability and lining up meet day with a certain predictably strong point of training. But in short, like I said, the TLDR is this is my preferred way of peaking when we can make it work out, and it's become very popular in the more so modern powerlifting programming strategies these days. So again, once I start explaining things, things will make a bit more sense in terms of how I personally approach training into meets. And after I explain the whole concept of it and when someone should train into a meet, how to actually do it, a couple other important things to note, then I have 5 different lifter case studies that I will go over, which will be more so the bulk of this video. So, what is training into a meet? There's a common misconception that training into the meet means that you are not tapering into the meet. And that, in my opinion, is incorrect. There can absolutely be a taper associated with training into the meet. Taper meaning, some kind of reduction in workload or intensity going into the meet, typically towards the tail end of prep, right? However, training into the meet does not mean we are not tapering a single thing. It just means we are not adding an additional taper week to the end of someone's prep. So for example, let's say someone has a 13-week prep, and someone who may want to add an additional taper week to that prep to come in really recovered on meet day would probably run something along the lines of 3 4-week blocks, and then that 13th week would be a taper week where workload and intensity is pulled back big time. Versus if someone were to train into the meet on a 13-week prep, the first week of their prep might be an intro week, and then they would run 3 4-week blocks into the meet, with the final day of prep, which would typically be probably, we'll say, a Saturday, assuming a meet is on Saturday. That final day of prep would just be meet day. Okay, so that's the big common misconception that I like to bring up in the very beginning of things when explaining this whole concept. Training into the meet just really means there is no additional taper week. But on top of that, you can, in a sense, add an additional taper week within the same length of someone's block. So what I mean by that is, say someone runs a 4-week block and you're training into the meet, you want to line up the final session of that 4-week block, the final session of prep essentially, with meet day. But you can kind of twist this idea of not adding an additional week by just having that entire final week of prep be a taper. So again, there's kind of a middle ground where there are certain things that you can and possibly should taper off of someone's final week, which again would be the final week of someone's penultimate block of prep, versus adding the additional week. So that brings up the topic of block length needing to be consistent within this as well. So again, training into the meet is really just lining up that certain day or session of training with the day of a meet. So if someone's got a predictable Saturday, line that day up with meet day, barring meet day is on Saturday. But with the whole tapering concept, there are a lot of cases where some lifters will not taper a single thing at all, and those are the majority of the time. That's the type of lifter who needs a lot of workload, is a high frequency, high volume, high intensity lifter who needs all that stimulus to stay primed and keep their fitness high in training. And where workload or intensity is stripped, comes a decrease in performance. So oftentimes some lifters will not taper a single thing. Maybe they'll get rid of some biceps and triceps the week of the meet, but besides that, that week of training is identical with the final week of their block. So when should someone actually train into the meet? A couple things I wrote down. A big thing is when an athlete has primary sessions on the day that someone is competing. So for example, maybe it's a national meet, someone's competing on a weird day like Thursday. It might be a good idea to actually line up someone's training and reorganize someone's microcycle. So certain primary days that you're looking to line up with meet day are on Thursday in training. But for the most part, competitions, powerlifting meets are going to be on a Saturday or a Sunday, mostly Saturday. So it can be a good idea to throw those primary days on Saturday or train someone into the meet where one or more primary sessions are already on Saturday. Personally, I'm a big fan of throwing primary bench sessions on Saturday because in my opinion, bench can be the trickiest to peak into a meet day. So that's why I usually have a primary session for bench on a Saturday, so it's easiest to peak in a meet day because it's already on the day that someone's going to be competing. It's best done with lifters of high predictability, so people who can go block after block and week after week, knowing these certain trends and being able to predict performance within certain sessions throughout a block very consistently. It's also a good opportunity for someone to train into a meet. Like I mentioned, when athletes detrain or lose strength, lose fitness, lose the ability to perform or execute when a reduction in workload or intensity is present. So if a lifter under that demographic runs an additional taper week, it might hurt them because they're missing so much stimulus that they know they need to be strong. Along those notes, on the opposite end, when an athlete fatigues quickly and having an additional taper week is not enough time for them to perform at their best. So, for example, one of my athletes, Brendan, he'll run 4-week blocks, and sometimes it'll take him 1 or 1.5, maybe 2 weeks to fully recover from a really, really heavy week 4. So if we were to run an additional taper week for him, that 1 week of additional training might not be enough to kind of have a sweet spot of pulling back and tapering certain components, mainly intensity, and then coming in his best on meet day. So instead, lining up that final session of meet day doesn't give us the opportunity to have this really, really big bang so close to the meet where they don't have the opportunity to actually recover from that. So how does someone actually train into the meet? The first thing is establish predictability in training. If you do not have any predictability in training, actually lining up a certain session or a certain week or a certain block, whatever it may be, going into meet day can be a bit risky. So usually what I advise to do is if you're looking for the most predictable outcome on meet day, already mentally plan to have someone's prep trained in. There's gonna be times when, again, additional taper week is the best course of action, but that predictability should come first. In my opinion, predictability is king. It's the number one thing that we should be striving to achieve in training. And then from there, it can be a lot easier to make tweaks going forward to yield progress. So that's the first thing, is you gotta establish predictability in training. Other than that, oops, I just clicked on that. Other than that, pulling back on fluff or non-specific accessory work. The goal of the week that someone competes is not really to gain muscle. So for example, doing a bicep curl or a quad extension or something is probably going to do more harm than good for someone's meet if they're doing it so close to meet day, because their muscles are going to be a bit sore than they need to be. However, there are certain more specific accessories that need to be kept in, like a belt squat or maybe a dip or a chest press machine. Some people need certain accessories to contribute to the weekly workload per block, and those need to be kept in for predictability purposes going into meet day. You also need to line up exposure timing. So for example, if someone's primary squat day is on Wednesday and their secondary squat day is on Saturday, and there is a 3 day rest period, 3 rest day gap, I guess to call it, between the secondary and primary squat. Um, it is going to be the most predictable course of action to actually move that final squat session to Tuesday, because now we are lining up the exact same amount of rest days that lifter is taking in training leading into their primary day. So that's a big one, is lining up the timing of exposures with certain primary days going into meet day. When I get into the case studies, that'll make a bit more sense. Then the other couple points are really just to know your athlete. You need to understand what certain stimulus is needed for the athlete, understand their leverages, their demographic, what they respond well and poorly to, what fatigues them and what doesn't. What are certain components needed in training? Are certain components in training needed for the long term or the short term? Chris has a really great Instagram post on this in terms of what to actually remove during a taper week or a meet week. Whereas, like I said, this kind of ties into the whole non-specific versus specific conversation, where maybe a belt squat you might want to keep in the week of a meet versus a quad extension is not as specific and you're not actually getting those reps in that may contribute to total squat workload. So those are another couple things to keep in mind. And then another final considerations to make before I get into the case studies is definitely trial this in training. Like I said, if you already have predictability established, perfect. But it never hurts to, especially if you're really far out from a meet, trial this in training to actually establish that predictability. And like I said, just do a trial run and see how that works. So your predictability is heightened even further going into meet day. The good news is that trialing it should not be really that hard, because there's not a lot of tweaking that may need to be done to trial actually training into the meet. Because, for example, if someone has multiple primary days on Saturday, you're already trialing if that Saturday is coming in strong in training, barring it's the final week of a block. Another important consideration is this is not a viable peaking approach for all lifters. It might not work, and it definitely cannot work for a lot of people. Typically the lifters who need some kind of larger scale pullback to be at their strongest. There's also a psychological component to it, where some people may not be actually bought into the idea of doing this. But in my opinion, predictability is king, like I said. So in my opinion, the best course of action, if you want to establish the highest degree of predictability going into meet, is to first establish that predictability in training and then train someone into the meet to peak their performance on meet day in the first place. The first case study I want to go over is my lifter L, and you can see I have 5 case studies ready at the bottom here in tabs. The way I have them laid out in order is they're going to progressively get more complicated. So for example, L is one of the more simple cases, whereas all the way at the end, my lifter Megan is going to be a bit more complicated if we want to hypothetically train her into a meet. So with L, she's a 65 kilo female. She is consistently strongest on the 5th week of her block. Every single week 5, we know that that is going to be the strongest week. So already have predictability established there in terms of hopefully lining that up and training her into a meet. Couple general notes: she biases more towards needing to be recovered on deadlift. She's got a little bit more of a rounded back style, conventional, really sticky lockout, fatigues her a lot, longer range of motion, things of that nature. Bench cannot be pushed too hard, specifically on her Monday and Thursday, but on Tuesday and Saturday, they can be and they need to be. And then squat is a pretty linear ramp up throughout the block. She needs to push Wednesday fairly hard in order for Saturday to come in. She's got SSB back offsets in the higher rep ranges on Wednesday that really fuel that Saturday's performance, but it is a pretty linear ramp up throughout the block. So here's her general microcycle layout. So all the way on the left, you're going to see Sunday. All the way on the right is going to be Saturday. She benches on, like I said, Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Saturday. And then she'll squat on Tuesday, Saturday, and deadlift Wednesday, Saturday. So like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, she's already got multiple primary sessions on Saturday. Barring she competes on Saturday, these are already lined up for her. And beyond that, there really is not much to change if we want to train her into a meet. So again, this is her normal layout, and this is what meet week is going to look like. There are no changes. Nothing is different because she already meets the criteria for this to be done. We have predictability established. Multiple primary days are on the Saturday or just meet day, whatever day that may be. And there really is no adjustments that need to be made for exposure timing. We can keep all of her bench sessions where they are, and do exactly her typical week 5 bench microcycle on Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, leading into Saturday in order for Saturday to come in strong. So you can see, same thing for squat and deadlift, right? She's got both secondary days on, she has a primary day on Wednesday, but she got her secondary squat on Tuesday going into that primary session Saturday. But then her final deadlift session is going to stay on Wednesday, just knowing that we're going to be tapering that off because we don't want to be throwing that on Tuesday to, combine both squat and deadlift and throw things off. And that's something I forgot to mention in the beginning is when we move sessions in order to reorganize exposure timing, it's very important to make sure that we are being careful of possibly relocating squat and deadlift too much because there can be overlap there, especially, for example, if someone deadlifts before they squat, or maybe deadlifts in the same day that they squat midweek, and then we move a squat session after that, that deadlift session actually might fatigue that squat session too much. So for L, what we are going to be doing is keeping everything the same. And you can see in this little box here, I wrote, changes include, all we really need to do essentially is reduce accessory workload and intensity, and taper off that Wednesday deadlift session big time. So I'll zoom out a bit so it's easier to see. But on the left here is her normal week of training, what her typical week 5 is going to look like versus how we are actually changing that for meet week and what that looks like when we train into the meet. So here we go. On the left, her typical Monday is just going to be 4 sets of 8 on bench. She's got weighted dips, single arm kneeling cable row, and shoulder width cable lat pull down. But for this session, when we train into the meet, again, hypothetically, this is what a meet week is going to look like for her with Saturday being meet day. We're going to be keeping bench the exact same. We're not going to be pulling anything back here. We're going to get rid of most of her dips and reduce intensity there. Instead of getting rid of them entirely, I'm keeping some dips in there because those do somewhat contribute to bench workload throughout the week and they are fairly specific. Then I'm actually going to be keeping 2 sets of the single arm kneeling cable row in here just for keeping the scaps and the arms moving, promoting that blood flow and getting things moving in the first place, but significantly reducing intensity because the purpose with that here for meet week is not to gain muscle. It's just to keep her moving a little bit so she doesn't feel stiff on meet day. Difference on Tuesday is pretty much only getting rid of accessory work. This is all arm stuff. She's got triceps, biceps, and that's it. So we're just going to be getting rid of those entirely going into her meet because we don't need those. And her squat session is going to stay the exact same, pushing it very hard. Same thing with back off sets. For Wednesday, like I mentioned, the biggest thing is just going to be pulling back big time on deadlift. Bench is going to stay very heavy. So on deadlift, we're just going to have a really easy single at RP 4 to 5 with one super easy back off set. This is like easy RDL weight for her, just to keep a little bit of volume in. So she's not only doing 1 rep here, and because she has a 2-time week deadlifter. And then for bench, like I said, there's no differences here. We're going to keep those the same and then get rid of the hamstring curls that she usually has on this day in its entirety. For Thursday, we're going to be keeping bench the exact same. You can kind of see the theme here. We're just fully training bench in to understand that we're just lining up that predictable week 5 primary bench that's on Saturday with meet day and just getting rid of accessory work. And that's going to be how we peak bench essentially, so just get rid of the accessory work. Then boom, she competes on Saturday. Next up is my lifter Jake, and a couple tidbits about him. He's a 100 kilo male. A lot of the times he needs to be, biased more towards the end of needing to be recovered. But for him, he needs a lot of stimulus, and he does. His performance does tend to trend up throughout the training block, and he does need to be primed to a certain extent, especially on bench. He's consistently strongest in the final week of his block. So again, we have predictability established there. We've already lined that up before we've written out this peaking protocol. He, like I kind of just mentioned, he holds a fair amount of fatigue coming into week 1, so he does need to be biased towards needing to be a bit more recovered, but he does need certain stimulus to come in at his strongest. All 3 lifts still get a boost in performance from an intensity reduction, so there are certain areas that we can pull back in terms of intensity to heighten performance on meet day. For example, one of those is deadlift responds really well to RDL being pushed in the long run, but a short-term pullback on RDLs does inflate performance a bit, so that's something we can keep in mind. His secondary squat is also largely indicative of how his primary squat will perform. So for example, if he has a really strong Wednesday, pretty much every single time that Saturday is going to come in strong. And again, that's a deadly piece of predictability that we have in training that we can use to our advantage to peak predictably into meet day. So how we have his training oriented is on Monday, he benches and deadlifts. That's his only day that he deadlifts off the floor. Wednesday, he's got his secondary squat day, secondary bench day. Thursday, he's got his really easy priming bench, essentially, just his fourth bench day. He's got RDLs on Thursday, and that's what we call his secondary deadlift. And then on Saturday, he's got two primary days, his primary squat and his primary bench. That's what his normal week of training looks like. And you can see here on the bottom, like I mentioned, these are getting slightly more complicated as they go on. So for Jake, the I guess the addition from what we did with L is on Thursday we just got rid of RDL. So we're actually making some kind of adjustment here. So the changes include as well a reduction in accessory work, just pulling back on those fluff accessories that we don't really need, that don't really contribute to workload going into meet day. We're going to be pulling back slightly on secondary day squat back-offs, again, knowing that he does respond well to some kind of intensity reduction for the most part. And what we also do for him in training is usually on his week 4s, we pull back a little bit on his Thursday priming bench day to get that Saturday bench to show up stronger, and it works every single time. So we're going to be doing that on meet week as well. And then we're also going to be fully removing that Thursday RDL day, which we push and dynamically increase in load every single week. But we don't want to be doing his heaviest RDLs of the block 2 days out from meet day. So coming to look in at how we orient that final week of prep, which is going to be meet week with this approach, right? On the left, this is going to be his normal week 4 Monday. He's going to have a single or a top set of a certain rep count. Again, you can see the range is pretty heavy for him here. Top set of 6 at an RPE with a pretty normal bench structure for him on Monday, which is going to be a top set of 8 with 2 sets of 8 for back off sets. Then he's got to have his back and hamstring and bicep accessories here. Going into meet week, what we're going to be doing is tapering off deadlift, because we don't want to have him taking, an at 9 deadlift single in between 252.5 and 270 5 days out from meet day. Because that will fatigue him, just knowing him as a lifter, and also just for exposure timing purposes, it doesn't really make sense to have this RDLs on Thursday and then competing on Saturday. We're going to be deadlifting 3 times in a week essentially, so we do taper off pretty significantly on this session, again, as it's also not lined up with Saturday. So we're going to have a single at 5 RPE. He has a 1x6 at 3 to 4 RPE for back offs. But for bench, we're going to be fully training that into meet day. It's lined up with Saturday. We know that we need to keep stimulus high here. So we are going to have, again, just a normal week 4 Saturday there with no changes. And then like I kind of mentioned with L, there are certain accessories that are non-specific that I do like to keep in during meet week, just for the sake of keeping movement fresh and blood flow promoted. So relatively speaking for him there, what I did is I just kept 2 sets of a shoulder width mag grip pull down, which is what he usually has on this day. Got rid of the single arm kneeling cable row, hamstrings, and bicep superset that I have him do. For Wednesday, this is going to be one of the days that are slightly different. Bench, we're going to have his typical secondary bench session, which is a 2 count double with a very high RPEs, going all the way up to like an 8 to 9 RPE here. And this is on Wednesday of meet week. So again, you can kind of see we're really buying into the idea that bench needs to be trained in. Keeping that high RPE back off set of 5 with all the rest being percentage based. We are going to keep belt squat in and push it fairly hard, knowing that his back off sets on comp squat are going to be reduced a little bit. This is how we keep that intensity in there, as well as not getting rid of belt squat entirely, because his legs are likely not going to feel as under him and as poppy as they would otherwise. And that is a specific accessory that we do keep in for him. And you can see here the reduction in intensity at the top left of my screen. We're going to be pulling back roughly on 6% here, usually roughly around like that 3% mark is what we found is 1 RPE or so. So we're going to pull off 6% on the 2x6 to get that about 2 RPE easier for him. And then we're going to get rid of all the fluff accessories here, which are for him adductor machine and triceps. For Thursday, like I mentioned, we're getting rid of his RDLs entirely, and we're going to actually strip the entirety of his accessories here, just as he's 2 days out here, and we don't really need any of this here. And this is just going to be his priming bench day with a typical pullback on the 3x8 backoffs here. Not the 3x backoffs, with the 3x1 tempo. We're going to keep the 3x8 backoffs the same. The area that we taper here routinely for him is the tempo singles. And then resting on Friday as always, and then he competes on Saturday. And that's how we train him into the meet. Super simple. Bench is identical other than the 3x1 being a bit lighter. Deadlift is identical other than pulling back on Monday and getting rid of RDLs to, again, essentially get a bit of a taper there. And like I said at the beginning, training into the meet does not necessarily mean we are not tapering anything. And then squat is pretty much the exact same, just with -6% on this 2x6 back off. Next up is my lifter Patrick. He's a 90 kilo male. We have multiple primary days for him lined up on Saturday, and just like Jake's RDL, I wrote an example here from Jake's example previously. Just like his RDL, we do really well with a pullback on his Wednesday secondary day, but we also do really well with pushing that stimulus pretty hard in the long run. Like he's got a pretty difficult and high intensity secondary session. Again, just like Jake's RDL, we do really, really well with pushing that in the long run, block after block, macro after macro. But once we get a short-term pullback there, that's when performance skyrockets, right? Similar to Patrick's secondary deadlift, we typically routinely pull that back by about 3 to 4%. Going into his final primary day of each block, but going into meet day, we pull that back a bit more, roughly around like 8 to 9%. So usually about twice as much, and he comes in even stronger. But we'd probably be missing on more valuable stimulus if we did that more regularly. So that's why we hold that off until meet week. He's consistently strongest on week 5. I wrote bench is consistently strongest on week 5 specifically because there is more of a noticeable difference there, whereas squat and deadlift are a bit more consistent performing throughout each week. But we do know that final week of each block is the strongest, so we have good predictability established there. And then he's also not really the type of lifter who needs to be primed. He does really good with needing to be recovered. So certain pullbacks and reduction in intensity does him well. But he does need a certain adequate amount of stimulus to come in strong on all 3 lifts. So the way we've organized his meet week, and you can see normal layout on the top still, meet week layout on the bottom, is so for him, bench is going to be the exact same. He benches on his primary bench is on Saturday. He benches on Monday and Thursday besides that. So we're just going to keep those bench days on Monday and Thursday. For deadlift, same exact thing. The only difference is we pull back on that Wednesday intensity by, again, about 8 to 9% compared to the 3 to 4% that we usually do on week 5. And then Saturday comes in super strong. So we're keeping that final deadlift session on Wednesday, and we're going to do a pretty typical week 5 there. Just slightly more, less intense. And then squat is the only one that is a bit different because he has his primary squat on Monday and his secondary squat on Friday. If we wanted to hypothetically line up exposure timing with meet day, his final squat day would be on Wednesday because then he would have that 2-day gap from Thursday to Friday going into Saturday. But for Patrick, what we do is I don't want him going from Friday to Wednesday and having that long, rest period, full 4 days of rest. Well, technically 5, going from Friday to Wednesday. But I also don't want him to be squatting 3 days in the same week, knowing he's going to be squatting Saturday on meet day. And I don't want to have him squat Monday and then have a filler day or something on Wednesday. Just knowing Patrick, again, like I said at the beginning of this video, one of the most important things about training to the meet is to know your athlete. And just knowing him, he needs to be recovered on squat. So we do need to have some kind of a pullback there. So we meet halfway. Instead of focusing too much on lining up exposure timing, we have that Tuesday is going to be his final squat session. Halfway in between Monday and Wednesday, we keep volume pretty normal there and just have a reduction in intensity. So again, training into the meet does not mean we are not tapering anything at all. In some cases it does. But for Patrick, that final squat session is going to be pretty significantly pulled back, relocated to Tuesday, and then bench and deadlift are going to have more of a true train into the meet with less of a reduction across the board. So for how we have that organized, his normal week starting on Monday that we will typically end a block on is going to be 2 triples. One is heavier, one is lighter in the descending fashion with a percentage-based 3x5 on high bar. An example secondary day for him is we're going to have 5 total sets, usually in like the 3 to 4 rep range, push all the way to 8.5 RPE. He's got tempo hack, squat, and quad extensions on this day. For meet week, we are going to, like I said, relocate that primary squat to Tuesday, pull back intensity. So, for example, to end the block, what would usually be maybe 232.5 at 8.5 RPE or something like that. Again, just an example there. This is actually from an old block, so he's much stronger now. Versus, say, like a 207.5 single for meet week. So, again, we're pulling back pretty significantly on that, on peak intensity here. Easy triple after that. and his high bar back downs are also reduced here. We can call this actually a single, I guess, just for consistency's sake, block to block there. And then we're actually going to keep the tempo hack squat in on this session because not only are we moving that squat day, which is different and slightly less predictable, but I don't want to get rid of the total amount of workload on this day, knowing that hack squat is a fairly consistently predictable accessory for him. And on that Monday, the only thing that will remain is that bench, which is going to be typical for week 5. It's going to be his week 5 Monday bench session. We're getting rid of quad extensions entirely. For Wednesday, we're going to get rid of triceps because we don't need those. Get rid of RDLs because that's going to contribute to the taper that we're going to get from pulling back on this session. We're going to pull back on some additional percentage here. You can see at the top left, this is going to be minus 17%. Versus the minus 14 that we usually have. So roughly minus 3%. So getting rid of around 1 RPE difficulty on the 2x5 here. And then on Thursday, which is going to be his final session, is going to be his typical week 5 tertiary bench, 2 sets of a single arm kneeling cable row, and then getting rid of the rest of those accessories as we're 2 days out, but keeping a little bit in just to, again, keep things moving. Resting on Friday because we've lined up that exposure timing a bit better for squat and we don't want to be squatting 1 day out. Getting rid of the lateral raises and rear delt flies that are usually on Friday for him, and then boom, competing on Saturday. For my lifter Abby, this is where things get a little bit more individual and where it can be a bit more important to know your lifter, where this is actually a peak protocol that I just wrote out for her upcoming meet in March, so we'll see how it goes, but it is pretty much identical to what we've done in the past. For Abby's typical weekly layout, she rests on Monday and Friday. She benches on Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, so 4 times a week. You can see my liking of having primary bench on Saturday by this point because everyone I've listed so far, that's the case. She deadlifts on Sunday and Thursday and then squats on Wednesday and Saturday. Her primary squat's Wednesday and her primary deadlift is on Sunday. So all 3 primary days are on different days throughout the week. How we've organized that to peak her into meet day is, well, first thing is bench is very, very simple. Her primary day is already on Saturday, and you can see in the notes that I wrote here, she's a 70 kilo female with a highly technical short range of motion bench. She does really, really well with high intensity and high rep per set count on bench. So we just keep all of that stimulus in for the final week of her block, aka training into the meet. Whereas she's a bit of the opposite on deadlift. She has a longer range of motion. Deadlift fatigues her more, but she's more intensity sensitive than volume sensitive, in the sense that volume needs to stay in to a certain degree for her on deadlift. So if we, for example, just get rid of a whole session or miss half of her back downs or something, it's probably not going to do her that well. But pulling back on the volume to an extent does do well for her, but it's really that intensity that we're looking to get rid of, and she peaks like crazy. When we do that. And then for squat, it's kind of a mixture of the both, of the two, where we need to have a predictable amount of stimulus and workload in order for a certain day for her to show up strong, but she does get a little bit of a boost in performance from pulling back a little bit on intensity. So what we did, and this is where things get a little bit more individual, and I'll start with squat, because again, bench is really easy. We just keep all of her bench days exactly the same with a typical end of block week for her, with Saturday being her final primary day of the block, aka meet day. But for squat, if we were to line up exposure timing for her, that final squat day would technically need to be on Tuesday, because going into her primary session, she has 3 full rest days of a gap. And if we were to have her final squat day on Wednesday, she would only have 2 full rest days of a gap going into meet day. So if we want to heighten predictability and line up this session with meet day, knowing that it's going to come in strong and line up exposure timing appropriately, we would need to relocate that squat session. But I wrote in the notes here, we actually had her primary squat on Saturday before with her secondary squat on Wednesday about 7 months ago when she competed last, and it went really well with that final squat session on Wednesday, because we just kept that secondary before 7 months ago on Wednesday and lined that up going into meet day. So again, we have 2 options here. One is we could have bumped that primary squat to Tuesday during meet week just to line up exposure timing, or knowing that she peaked really well into her last meet 7-ish months ago with that final squat exposure on Wednesday, it might just be wiser to do exactly that again and throw the exposure timing rule out the window. So that's what we're doing. We're keeping that final squat day on Wednesday. And like I said, that's when knowing your lifter can be super helpful in times like this. For deadlift, we also have adjusted exposure timing a little bit, and it's not necessarily perfect. Well, actually is perfect, but she will technically be deadlifting 3 times this week. Okay, and knowing her, like the volume does her well, but it's the intensity we're trying to hold back on. So I'm not too worried about the frequency increase here. But it is essentially perfect with exposure time because we bumped that secondary day from Thursday to Wednesday, which is consistent with the 2 rest day gap that we have going into her primary day in training. So we have exposure timing lined up. All we need to do is make sure that her 2 sessions on meet week are not too difficult, essentially. So her normal Sunday is going to be single with a triple full resets on deadlift and a percentage-based 2x4. That's going to be her typical week 4 or her final week of each block session. It's going to be really hard. And then for meet week, we pull that back. So we keep a lot of, well, not a lot, but we keep a decent amount of volume in here. We have the single, the triple, and 1 set of 4. But it's all going to be just significantly reduced with intensity. This is her exact same week 4 Sunday bench, and then we got rid of most of her accessory work. Again, you can see the theme here with what I do with back accessories, just to keep the shoulders moving and the rib cage moving. Shoulder width mag grip pull down here. We got 2 light sets and then 2 sets of a kneeling cable crunch, which she usually has on this day, that are just lighter, again, to keep the rib cage and spine moving a bit so she's not feeling stiff. For her secondary bench, pretty straightforward, just keeping that the exact same with 1 set of neutral grip dumbbell press, getting rid of the other 2 sets that she usually has, and getting rid of the arm stuff on this day. Primary squat we're going to keep here and just pull back on intensity, keep the exact same amount of volume. And then deadlift is we're just going to do 1 set of 6 when that secondary session is usually 3 sets of 6. So again, we're getting rid of volume, but we're not making a big reduction that, to the point that we're missing out on valuable stimulus. But she is also technically going to be deadlifting 3 times this week. So we do need to keep that in mind, as well as the fact that she does peak super well with a larger scale reduction in intensity. Have her doing 2 sets of rows here at a really light RPE, and then I have her doing her 2 normal sets of a heel elevated goblet squat on Wednesday, which again, I consider to be a specific accessory. And then her final session is going to be on Thursday, which is the exact same week 4 bench session that she always has. Resting Friday, competing on meet day on Saturday. And the final example I have is my lifter Megan, which is a hypothetical example because she is also going to be competing in March, and I have not written her final block of prep yet, as she still has 1 block before that. But this is hypothetically what we are going to be doing when we train her into meet day. So a little bit about her. She's an 82.5 kilo female. She needs to be primed on all 3 lifts. She very much so responds well to a high degree of volume and intensity, but there's a sweet spot to that. We can't just hammer her with a bunch of stuff. There's going to be a point of diminishing returns there in terms of fatigue and fitness. She's a tall lifter with a more rounded back conventional with longer range of motion, and that is the one lift for her that fatigues her the most. Is if we push deadlift intensity consistently very hard, it does tend to beat her up. Whereas bench, she can eat up workload, eat up intensity, pretty similar with squat. And then the big thing for her is her weekly layout is not very convenient for peaking into a meet. We have her rest on Saturday just for life schedule stuff, and her other rest day is on Wednesday. So you can see, a bit different than the other 4 examples I gave. No primary days on Saturday, where her meet day is going to be on Saturday. So we need to line up all 3 lifts on a day of the week that she doesn't even get into the gym. So it's a bit more complicated. This is also a good piece of reference for those who may compete at a national or regional level meet where there's a certain day that someone's competing that is not even on the weekend. So to run over her normal week of training before we adjust it going into the meet to train her in. And again, the reason we're training her in is because we know that she does well with stimulus. She's not really the strongest on a week 1, so if we did do an additional taper, we would hypothetically be pulling back on too much workload, so it fits her demographic pretty nicely, especially knowing that she's consistently strongest on the final week of her block. So to go over her normal week, she squats 3 times a week, Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. Her primary squat is on Thursday. And then bench is 4 days a week, Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. You can see I'm trying to get that primary bench as close to the tail end of the week as I can. And then on deadlift, she pulls twice a week. Her secondary day is pretty easy, and that's on Friday. And then her primary deadlift is a bit more intense, and that's going to be on Monday. So the way we've oriented things, I'll start with bench, but she's actually technically going to be benching 5 times during meet week if you count meet day as that 5th day, although she will only be doing 3 reps of bench on meet day. So we're going to keep that tertiary day on Sunday. But what we need to do to make this primary day, which again is going to be her week 5 meet day, as predictable as possible, is I would like to have the timing of exposures from her secondary and quaternary sessions equal going into her primary day. So what that would need to look like is that quaternary needs to be on Friday to make it 1 day away from her primary day, aka meet day. And her secondary day I would like to be 2 days in front of her quaternary day, which is what she usually does in training. So if we want to line that up, her secondary day would be on Wednesday, and her quaternary would be on Friday, both equidistant from where they would be in training relative to that primary session. But I also don't want her to not be benching 2 days fully for 2 days. Like I don't want her to have 2 consecutive days with no benching at all. So we have added a filler bench day, which is something she does not really do in training, and I'll get to what that looks like when I go over her week. But that is the small adjustment we've made to bench, alongside moving those tail end sessions towards further towards the end of the week to line up exposure timing. For squat, we've taken a similar approach where if we want to line up exposure timing going into meet day, we can keep that final squat day on Thursday. It's just a matter of what that session looks like. So we don't want to be doing, a really heavy week 5 primary session 2 days out from meet day. There needs to be some kind of adjustment that should be made there. But from an exposure timing perspective, we can keep all of her squat days where they are. And then for deadlift, it was a bit easier for deadlift. All we did was bump that final session from Monday to Tuesday just to even out exposure timing a little bit. And for her, this secondary deadlift, sure, is only two full rest days away from that primary day. So if we did want to line up exposure timing perfectly, her final session would be on Wednesday. But just knowing her, again, this is where it's important to know your lifter, it doesn't really make sense for us to deadlift 3 days in a week, even with the filler session, with the added frequency on squat and bench already. So we're just kind of meeting it halfway, similar to what we did with Patrick's primary squat, bumping that final deadlift session from Monday to Tuesday and pulling back on intensity big time so that final deadlift session isn't too far away from meet day. But that's what we've done in terms of organizing meet week to train her into the meet. So what that actually looks like is you can see her secondary squat's going to be the exact same. No touches to that session at all. And then her tertiary bench session is also going to be the exact same. And she actually usually has a bit more accessory work here, which I already got rid of because we're going to be, this is what the final week of her current block looks like. We've adjusted that a bit, but in short, this dumbbell set is going to be all she has going into meet week relative to what she usually has. So I'll actually just add this back in just for reference sake. All right, there we go. So you can see the difference here. We just got rid of all of her incline press on this day and then got rid of 2 sets of neutral grip dumbbell press. Her normal week of training is going to be a top set. Again, this is what her final week of the blocks typically look like. A heavy top set, usually around that 8 to 9 RPE. We've got 4 sets of 5 for back offs at different percentages, and then a bunch of back and bicep work. But we're just with lining up exposure timing. We don't train on Monday. And then on Tuesday, what that is going to look like for meet week is her typical tertiary squat, again, training that into the meet, not pulling back on that really at all. Her secondary bench gets bumped down from Tuesday to Wednesday, so that's not going to be on Tuesday anymore. Instead, we're going to have a filler bench day, which the only thing I added was 2 sets of tempo. Reason being, she does really well with tempo. Again, why it's important to know your lifter. And I don't want to give her, a 3x5 or a 3x8 or give her something really challenging, because the purpose of this day is to just bench. We don't really need to get a certain amount of workload or average intensity in. It's really just to bench and get that practice in, so we're not going 2 full days of no benching. Deadlift, like I mentioned, from Monday, that's going to get moved to Tuesday. So this is a bit of a weird session for her. It's going to be technically an SBD day. I accidentally clicked on the Abby tab, but her final deadlift session is going to be just a single at 4 to 5 RPE with a range. And then the only accessory work is just some seated cable rows here, again, to keep the shoulders moving and get some blood flow with some non-specific accessory work kept in without getting her overly sore. Secondary bench gets bumped down a day. It's going to be her typical 8 to 9 RPE, which she'll usually be hitting on her week 5. And then for her filler squat day, there's 2 strategies that we can hypothetically take. We can repeat this tertiary day, which is 2 sets of 8 on SSB, or we can just do a significantly pulled back typical primary Thursday squat. So that's the route that I took. She's going to have an extremely easy single with 2 extremely easy sets of 5. 1 set of leg press. Again, this is 2 days out, so we're keeping it very easy, but leg press is specific enough for her, knowing that she does need to be primed big time on all 3 lifts. So I don't want to get rid of that entirely necessarily. Her usual quaternary day on Thursday is going to be bumped to Friday, and that's going to be her final session. We're going to have actually a pretty hard bench day on Friday right before meet day. And then you can see no more secondary deadlift on Friday, obviously. No more hamstring curls or pull downs or triceps on Friday. No more, split squats on Thursday. We got rid of the rest of those fluff / non-specific accessories throughout the week. And that is how we are training her into meet day. So a lot more adjusting, but you can see how there can be some kind of a degree of customization needed for athletes who might not have a weekly schedule as oriented around peaking conveniently going into a Saturday. So my hope with the purpose of this video was to really emphasize that training into a meet is an excellent way to peak an athlete into a powerlifting competition with predictability in mind, right? We're looking to keep things as predictable as possible and also to eliminate the misconception that training to the meet means that we are not tapering anything in that sense. It just means that we're not tacking on that additional taper week to the tail end of prep. And instead, we are using the tail end of prep's predictability to line up a certain session of a certain week, of a certain block, of a certain macro cycle with meet day after having predictability established. And I listed out those 5 case studies and explained the adjustments that we make during someone's meet week in order to train them in to really emphasize the individual differences and how to kind of customize and characterize each lifter's training around peaking into meet day. So if you like this, feel free to leave a comment, give us a subscribe on YouTube, and if you have any questions, leave them down below.